Hi, I'm Spencer Krause. I've been building robots for over 20 years. In that time, I've seen a lot of interesting things, and I've heard a lot of interesting stories. Collaborative with Spencer Krause is a place where my colleagues and I can relax, crack a drink, and talk about some of the crazier things we've seen at work and some of the experiences we've had that have gotten us to where we are today. Subscribe today to join the collaboration. Welcome to the Collaborative Podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Krause. Our guest today is Eugene Demaitre. Eugene is the editorial director for the Robot Report, a co-host along with Mike Oitzman on the Robot Report podcast, and he helps put on two of the best trade shows of the year, the Robotics Summit and Expo in Boston and RoboBusiness in California, two of my favorite events to go to. Eugene's a very good friend of mine. Eugene, happy you're here. Welcome to the pod. Good to have you, buddy.
Well, thanks for having me, Spencer.
Thanks for coming on. Been wanting to do this for a long time.
Yeah, well, and again, I admire your podcast as well, so it's great to be able to share for a change and be on the other side of the mic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, it's always fun, too, for me to get interviewed and always fun to interview a podcast host. I had Chris Luecke on recently. I've interviewed your co-host, Mike Oitzman. I find that people that do this a lot are a little more natural, but also I have something I can relate to them on. So, how did you get into podcasting? I guess is maybe a good place to start. What was the first podcast you ever worked on, and how did you find kind of the cadence you found for one of the most influential podcasts in the industry?
Well, thanks for saying that. No, I've been working on podcasts on and off for a while now. It's actually several jobs ago, even before I got into robotics, where I was working on podcasts and webinars. And I realized that was a great format. And obviously, since then, podcasts have really exploded. And one of Steve Crowe's my priorities for as long as we worked together was to have more multimedia engagement, both in order to properly cover the growing robotics ecosystem, but also to engage with experts, with the audience. And so when we had the opportunity at WTWH Media to start up the Robot Report podcast, we both jumped at that because it was really a very different format. We were both relatively new to it, but we had listened to a lot of podcasts. And, we said, okay, who can we get that will be interesting to hear from? And it has obviously taken on a life of its own since then. I'm always amazed because when you're in a podcast studio like you are right now, you're just two people in the room talking. But I get stopped for selfies when I go to trade shows. I'm like, how do you know me? It's like, oh, I listen to the podcast. And that's always very flattering.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that's definitely happened. I had somebody recognize me in a bar, just in the robotics district of Pittsburgh, which is Lawrenceville. They're like, are you Spencer Krause? And I'm like, yeah. And they were like, I love your podcast. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. Thanks, buddy.
No, and there's the other thing that I think makes podcasts engaging is that people get to see the people behind the articles or behind the stories, right? And we can be a little bit more human in a sense, in that we can express ourselves in a way that's very different. And whether it's at the Robotics Summit and Expo, where I'm recording a bunch of episodes, or when we're out in the field, it's really an opportunity to get the people behind the technology, because so much of what we write is very technical or very business oriented. But at the end of the day, I always remind people I'm writing about people who use technology or develop technology for other people who want to do the same. The technology is in between, and the people are really the story.
Yeah, for sure. 100% agree. And what are some of the more interesting human moments you've had on your podcast?
Well, it's always, as a journalist, you always want to get that gotcha moment, right? You always want to get someone to open up or tell you something that maybe they weren't willing to say otherwise. I would actually say more interestingly is getting to understand, because I'm not an engineer by training, getting to understand how engineers approach different problems. And to me, I'm always learning every time I have a conversation. And that's always the most exciting part, is getting people on who are maybe in a sector I don't know that well, like surgical robotics or agricultural robotics. And they explain, oh, this is where the technology currently is versus what you might have seen or heard about. And it informs our coverage. Hopefully it informs our audience.
That's awesome. Yeah, I always learn so much just from talking to the people that are right up front doing it. Some of that's at work, some of that's on the podcast, and that's a great way to look at it, right? It's just an opportunity to learn. I really like interviewing people that are, to your point, like different from me. Like if I get somebody on that knows about AI, I'm not an AI expert. I know very little about it. So if somebody starts explaining how it works, I mean, yeah, I'm a little bit dumb in that conversation. So, it's you have to put your ego on the shelf, I feel like, a little bit, which is interesting. But then, once, like a good teacher, once they start explaining it, you're like, oh, wow, like this is super interesting. And I have to believe, you would know better than me, but for the audience, that must be nice too, just because like a lot of people don't know about, agricultural robotics or AI or, legged humanoids or any number of things that you might be covering.
That's actually one of the most fun parts of our job is that we get to look at the whole robotic space around the world. And I always tell people, if you focus only on one type of technology, yeah, you might be specialized, but you're missing out because so much of the innovation comes from places you don't expect, right? I mean, that's the whole point of our RBR50 Innovation Awards. That's the whole point of having that scope where, yes, we delve deep into automated warehouse, we delve deep into healthcare robotics, but we also look at everything from how does motion control affect manipulation in space to autonomous vehicles and operating in swarms and so many other things that there's never a moment to get bored in our space. And so every guest we have is coming from a different direction, has a different set of experience. And I'm always excited to hear what they're going to talk about because it saves me of having to visit every one of them individually, which is, of course, what I'd ideally love to do, is go and see them in their own places with their robots around them or with the warehouse or factory that they're working on.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think that's one of the things that got me into field robotics as well, is just the diversity of experience and applications that you get to see. I will say also, I've been such a huge fan of the RBR50 for pretty much like at least a decade. Like, I mean, it's always been where I've looked to be like, who's coming up, who should I be following, who's doing the coolest stuff right now, and the most industry shifting stuff. I don't know if I should mention, but it was just such an honor to be awarded one of those this year. I mean, I'm, it's a dream come true, and I guess I'm just internally grateful and humbled by the whole thing. But also,
well, no, congratulations to you for making the list. I can tell you it's always a difficult process when we're judging them, right? Because we always get lots of submissions across a very wide field. Our robot of the year was Waymo this year, right? I mean, last year it was Agility Robotics Digit. So we're talking some of the really cutting edge things.
yeah,
And to be part of that group is an honor, and we're absolutely happy to have you in it.
thank you so much. And I mean, Waymo is just a bad machine. If we can shift focus to them for a moment.
Sure.
I'm sure you've ridden in a bunch of Waymos, but the last time I was in the Bay Area, I hadn't ridden in one before, and I got in a Waymo, and it was awesome. I mean, it was able to like pull off to the side and go toe to toe with aggressive drivers in San Francisco, and do all this stuff. And then just for fun, me and the people I was with got a lift afterward, just with a human driver, much worse driver. Like starting.
Even
and
I had
stopping.
that same experience. We took a Waymo around the time of RoboBusiness last fall in San Francisco, and did it take a very constrained, cautious route? Absolutely. But the progress, I remember sitting in self-driving cars, I don't know, 6 years ago, and they were not anywhere near as capable as they are now. And so to be in a car with no driver, no safety driver in the front seat, out in the public roads, people might give you a second glance, but in those neighborhoods in San Francisco, they're used to it by now.
Yep.
And it got us there safely. And then we eventually called an Uber on the way back. And again, the human driver is going to be more erratic. The majority of traffic is still human driven, which is, you're really hanging on for your life in a big city like San Francisco or New York, or even a medium city like Boston. And to me, the fact that the development has continued at pace, and we're seeing more and more of these deployments nationwide, is very exciting because, well, we certainly waited long enough for it to happen.
Amen to that. No, it's totally awesome. And, I was wondering when I had that experience, if it was just, maybe I got a bad driver on the human side, but you relay in your story. I mean, I know a sample size of 2 isn't statistically significant, but it's more statistically significant than 1. And so I'm like, yeah, I think just when you side by side it, I think I'm going to do that again next time I'm in the Bay, but maybe get a few of them in a row it biases you, right? Like stuff I think you would normally forgive and be like, it's just how everyone drives. And when you benchmark it against that highly constrained, system, you notice, you're like, oh, wow, we really are, imperfect. And then it's also interesting because I feel like the standard that self-driving cars companies get held to is much higher than the standard that human drivers get held to, And so, I mean, I've interviewed Philip Coatman on the podcast a couple of times, and hopefully he doesn't fault me for saying any of this, but I mean, it's interesting, right? That like humans can almost get away with a lot more than robots can in that regard.
Well, we have a higher tolerance for risk. We have a higher tolerance for variance, which obviously with AI, cars are going to get better at dealing with. But the goal is not simply to replace human drivers, it's to eventually be safer and better. And I think once you explain it that way, no one's going to oppose it. It's more a matter of like, what are the steps along the way? And the standard has to be very high because the level of fatalities in the U.S. alone from human-driven cars is unacceptably high. And so if we're really going to make a dent in that, the self-driving cars, and this actually applies to a lot of automation, right? If you're going to replace certain tasks that are currently manual in a factory or warehouse, you have to do it better. Just simply doing human equivalent doesn't add efficiency, doesn't improve the overall function. And that's where much of what you and I talk about in our podcast is how do you get there? And both the technology, but then also the change management, the process understanding. There's so much that goes into that it's not a simple copy and replace function. You really have to go in there and understand the problem and then solve that problem.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I think you're right. I mean, I think, the reason that you and I are so impressed with Waymo and the world is, I mean, everybody that's been in one, I think, is because they've taken driving and gotten better at it than people, which is, it's no small feat. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, that's what makes them relevant and number one most innovative robotics company in the world.
Right. And
as per the number one most important list of top 50 robotics companies in the world.
Well, the RBR 50, as I said, we worked hard on that. We have some key categories that we like to call out. And again, Waymo is an example of what other companies in other types of robotics can aspire to in terms of, that safety record, that openness about the process of developing it. It takes a while. We talk about pilot purgatory. Well, you have to take the time to go through pilots and testing phases to get that feedback. And as much as there is excitement right now around generative AI, there's still going to be an element of trial and error. There's still going to be an element of, okay, we need to figure out where is this actually going to work the best and not just assume we can replace everything with it. Right? There's always that initial enthusiasm a year or two ago, like, oh, it's going to be the silver bullet. We can just replace everything boring with AI. And you sometimes hear that enthusiasm from the humanoid robotics developers as well. And much more likely is like, okay, where is this going to be the best fit? And then how do you get it to solve those problems in that specific situation? And so we already know that there's now going to be more, in the case of AI, there's going to be more specific or specialized data models, right? You can't just take, it's nice for ChatGPT, you can take the whole internet. And I had a couple of interviews this past week on that topic, but for robots, you have more specific, VLA models and the like. And then again, for other types of systems, you're not going to say, oh, one form factor for everything.
Right? Yeah, agreed.
You may need an AMR, you may need a mobile manipulator. I'm a big proponent of mobile manipulation. I think that's going to solve a lot of problems.
Specialization of labor.
But, all of automation, that's the road it's been on. And the promise of general purpose automation or artificial general intelligence it's there, but I would argue that's still a little ways out.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I'm one of these people that, when I was getting my master's degree in like 2014, I really drank the Carnegie Mellon Kool-Aid, and I was like, we're going to have self-driving cars on every road in America within 3 years, and Uber ATG was here in Pittsburgh, and they were really leading the charge on this side. I mean, obviously Waymo was quietly churning away and, methodically, spending money and resources and building a really awesome product at the same time that outlasted them. But
well, I don't want to discount Uber ATG, because one thing I will say is a lot of people who came out of that ended up going to other
sure,
autonomous vehicle
yeah,
companies,
Aurora, Argo,
truck companies, so
Latitude.
That's the ecosystem that we're in, right? And so that's the other thing, is that sometimes you focus on the company, and obviously for the RVR50, we do focus on companies and products, but sometimes it's the community and where people move around to. So I've worked at a bunch of different robotics publications over the years. I've been lucky to continue growing my knowledge throughout that time, but I would not have known 10 years ago that I'd be where I am now.
Did you know that Collaborative with Spencer Krause now has a merch store? Please go to cwskmerch.com for the latest in CWSK styles. You can get a hoodie, like the one I'm wearing, t-shirts, hell, we even have whiskey glasses. Everything in the store has custom art that our team worked really, really hard on, so go ahead and show your support for them, me, and the rest of the CWSK team by going to cwskmerch.com today. Better yet, support yourself and use discount code PODCAST10, all one word, all uppercase, for 10% off your entire order. Thanks for your support, and enjoy the rest of the show. With Spencer Krause is sponsored by SKA Robotics. If you're in the market for elite field robotics expertise, please consider hiring SKA Robotics. They sponsor this podcast and solve some of the toughest engineering problems in the world. SKA Robotics can be found at skarobotics.com. What made you decide to go down the road of journalism and robotics? Because that's not something everybody decides to do. I mean, and we kind of touched on it earlier, but not from the journalistic angle.
Yeah, well, so I'm going to go way back, because I'm not a roboticist or an engineer by training, not even a technologist by training. I was a poli-sci major as an undergrad. And so when people are like, oh, what are you doing in this space? It's like, well, I lucked out, to be honest. In grad school, I studied international relations, but one of my areas of focus was science and technology policy. And that eventually led to internships, that eventually led me into publishing. And so publishing, I went into journalism. I worked at a company called VNA, which is now part of Bloomberg. And then I worked at Computer World, which obviously at the time it was a huge tech and IT publication. And that's where really I got to sink my teeth into B2B journalism and tech media and all of that. And I had a couple of jobs after that, but I was covering Windows Client Server, and after a while, you can only write about Patch Tuesday so many times. And again, early on, that was exciting, because that was at one point the cutting edge of technology. But at a certain point, it became more standardized, and the opportunity presented itself to become a little more hands-on as a writer and editor. And so I went to E171 Media, which at that time was publishing Robotics Business Review.
Nice.
And I became an associate editor there, learned a lot. Steve Crowe was one of my first colleagues, and he continues to be my mentor, my partner, my guru.
He's rock solid.
And he has a nearly photographic knowledge or photographic memory of everybody in the industry. And I've learned tremendously from him. And it's when I started at RBR that then we started working on RoboBusiness. And that event had already been around for 5 or 10 years at that point. But again, learning the events industry, learning how to make sure that we serve our audience, not just in article form, but also in webcasts, in conference sessions, in getting out into the world. And it's been a real adventure ever since then. So I've been very fortunate.
That's wonderful. Well, it's interesting too. I didn't realize the Robotics Business Review wasn't originally with WTWH, and there was that journey. So it sounds like, I mean, you've worked for the same publication but under different ownership, which is pretty neat.
Yeah, and so RBR eventually got acquired by WTWH Media, and now it's part of the Robot Report. But the name RBR, still you hear it in the RBR 50, and that's why when people ask us, oh, where'd that come from? It's Robotics Business Review,
Yeah.
and that it picked the 50 top robotics companies, and it's now done so for, I think, like 13 years or something like that. So it's been around, it's well respected, and again, we've been fortunate to be able to turn it into something that people look forward to. I remember the first time I walked into a robotics company's offices, and they had a plaque on the wall proclaiming that they had been an RBR 50 winner. And we didn't give them that plaque. It was something that they had put up themselves. We're like, wow, I guess this does mean something to the companies that win. And since then, it has only grown in significance. And there's also, like with our Pitchfire event at RoboBusiness, which is a startup competition, imitation is the sincerest flattery. So we know that we're doing something right when we see a lot of other events pop up with similar programs. I will say one of the things since I came back to WTWH is that we've had now new categories within the RBR 50. So we've already talked about Waymo being the robot of the year, but we also have startup of the year. We have application of the year.
Awesome.
And then this year we added robots for good, which is, something that we hear so much doom and gloom about technology, about industry, about the economy. It's like, well, robots are designed to solve problems, and there are a lot of great teams out there who are doing good work. Why not honor them as well?
Tell me more about that. So, like, what was the impetus for doing the Robots for Good category? What kind of companies, are in there? Break it down for me, please.
Yeah, the submissions that we got were everything from things that are designed to help the environment, whether it's by reducing emissions or working in emerging energy or things like that, to things that assist people, right? There's a lot of people who have mobility issues or other health-related concerns that robots can help. And this year's winner, Hello Robot, or the premier winner, won for the Stretch 3 mobile manipulator. And I mentioned I like mobile manipulators before, so you know how I voted. But this is to help people with mobility challenges such as ALS or Parkinson's or things like that. And again, I'm a proponent of technology that not just helps make money, but can also help people along the way. And so that to me was one of the things. But we covered in the RBR 50 list in general, there's companies that are learning about whale behavior by using robots to tag them in a non-invasive way.
Oh, that's awesome.
We learn about robots that are going to hopefully help feed the world, because agriculture is a sector that's under stress from a lot of different directions, environment, labor, and so on, where robots can actually make things more efficient. We talk so much about the Industrial Revolution or the IT revolution, and everyone's like, oh, we're in the midst of the robotics revolution. But most people will acknowledge that it's still very early. We haven't fully realized the gains that we could achieve from the combination of software and hardware out in the field. And
100%.
So I think, we're only just beginning to understand, and as AI gets better, that flexibility, that applicability will only increase.
That's awesome. I love that. Huge fan of Stretch, by the way. Hello Robot is a great company. I really, really like what those guys are doing, developing low-cost hardware and just trying to make it more accessible. My buddy Chris Paxton was their head of embodied AI for a bit there, and he's always been a proponent of home robotics, like accessible robots that make everyday people's lives better. I did not realize they were doing stuff for Parkinson's. That just makes me like them more.
Well, and one of the other things that's noteworthy is that home robots or consumer robots in general is one of the toughest markets to crack.
Amen.
Right?
Amen to that.
And you know that, and a lot of people know that, and even, iRobot's a household name, and even they have struggled. And so, I think that's the other thing that makes it an achievement is like, okay, you're developing something that the space is going to be hard. Healthcare robotics in general is very challenging because you have to meet very high standards. In that sense, the companies like Waymo and Hello Robot that we recognize are the ones tackling the big challenges. And that's not to say that an AMR in a warehouse or a robot arm in a factory is not innovative. We're always looking for that as well. But it is, I think, noteworthy that this year's crop of winners, many of them are at this really cutting edge of innovation and trying to apply maybe existing component technologies, existing software and AI, but in ways that are new and beneficial.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot too, kind of, as I introspect and think about, the future of the kind of robots that I want to work on. And actually, somebody recommended to me, I don't know if you've read Simon Sinek's Infinite Game, but
I haven't read it.
It's good. I mean, it's a decent read. A buddy of mine, local Air Force colonel, told me to read it, and I checked it out. And, one of the things it was saying that kind of resonated with me is that, like the mission statement for your business should be something that people are going to rally behind even after you're gone. And so, SK Robotics' former mission statement was pretty lame. It was like something along the lines of like, we'll build whatever you want. Like, it wasn't exactly it, but that was the gist of it. And so, I thought a lot about it, and I introspected, and I talked to the advisory board, and we changed it to build robots to do the tasks that people can't, shouldn't, or don't want to do in order to improve human quality of life and efficiency of the economy. I feel like we could have made that last sentence shorter even, but, the idea
you're
is
not
that...
an editor, so I'll give you a pass on that one. But I think the goal is worthy. And again, why do most people end up getting into robotics? Because of the excitement, the challenge, but also because of that notion still of making the world better. That with many technologies, we've seen how, they can benefit society, but they can also hurt. And again, robotics is still new for all of the fears that we hear about Terminator and so on. And I have a rule, like if someone sends me an article with that movie citation in it, I'm going to take it out because it's a cliche now. Also, like I remember when that movie came out, and I'm old, so
yeah, it's a good movie.
It is a great movie. I want to be mindful of a young audience, but at the same time, there's so much promise, and most of the robots that are out there are very limited in their capabilities, but what they're doing isn't recognized enough. I think that when you talk about motion control and vision and sensing and locomotion, all those manipulation, all those very specific but not always sexy technologies, I'd much rather write about that, cover that, see it.
Oh, it's sexy to me.
Well, it should be sexy to probably most of our audience, but it is something that I've always called components, the unsung heroes of robotics, because none of that is possible without all these things that go into it. And I'm always trying to pick the robot apart and say, okay, whose actuator do you have, and what's your communications protocol, and all that sort of thing.
I love that.
Even though I'm not an engineer, like understanding how it works gives you an understanding of what it's going to accomplish, and hopefully it gives the audience an understanding of how it might help them. And that's really what we're always trying to get to.
That's awesome. And it reminds me of something, one of my professors said in school, which he was talking about computer processor, but I feel like the analogy is similar, which is, there's so many things that have to go right for this technology to work. It's a miracle it works at all. And so...
Well, and even more so because robotics, more than some other technologies that I've covered, is very collaborative in nature. I mean, it's competitive, of course, right? But it's very collaborative. I mean, what the Pittsburgh ecosystem's like. I'm lucky enough to be in Boston. We both go to Silicon Valley regularly.
Ecosystem. Yep, 100%.
And those are amazing. I love covering them. But part of it is that you have to get mechatronics and electronics and software engineers together in the room, even just to make anything work. And we already know, looking at government or looking at other institutions of society, that dysfunction is almost the norm. That, when people say, "Oh, business is more efficient than government," it's like they haven't sat through some board meetings where again, dysfunction is the name of the game. But in robotics, it's a lot of smart people coming together to apply their individual expertise to try to solve problems. They're coming together not just from different disciplines, but from all over the world. They're coming together from different stakeholders, right? So you've got your development community, you've got your integrators, you've got your hardware and software providers, you've got ultimately the end users, and they all have to agree on things in order to advance it. And so when people are like impatient, as we all are, oh, why isn't there more progress in this or that type of robot? I remind them, it's like, you know how many people have worked on this for how long? All these great CMU and MIT and Stanford graduates, they're doing the best they can in order to apply their brains to solve things in new ways. And so, one of the things that Steve and I love seeing is whether it was the DARPA Robotics Challenge or some of the earlier Boston Dynamics videos, is all the failures, because that shows you the halting steps along the way to success.
Yeah, 100% agree. I actually gave a talk for about 200 people at an event called Nerd Night here in Pittsburgh, and I called it Robots Gone Wild. And it was just about, I had DARPA fails in it. I had the Honda Asimo falling down the stairs. And the theme of the talk, and I used to do this more as a motif, and I feel like I kind of played it out a bit, so I've sort of stayed away from it lately. But it's that, if Honda and DARPA and all the greatest minds in the world can fail in these ways, like, who are the rest of us to be ashamed of our failures? I mean, I think there's a stigma attached to, completely normal in the face of R&D failures that have to occur in order to push the envelope of technology. And I think if it were just destigmatized a little bit more, then we would move faster as a society, and we wouldn't be so afraid to break things and advance the state of the art. And so that's kind of where the motivation for that comes from. But it really resonated with me when you said that.
Well, and there's a lot of understandable risk aversion, right? You're committing millions of dollars, a lot of people, a lot of time to solve certain problems. And, when there's a couple of different strains here. One is that there's a temptation to overpromise and underdeliver. And we saw that with the autonomous vehicles. We might be seeing that now with humanoids and AI, where there's a lot of excitement. And so the enthusiasm overtakes people and they make promises that they can't really live up to in the time frame they've discussed. How many years that we hear, oh, autonomous cars are around the corner.
Right. I fell for it.
It was probably 8 years before that actually became a reality, and still in a very limited sense. I've seen that with food robots. I've seen that with drones. The entire drone industry has pivoted a couple of times in order to try to find success. And so to understand the nature of technology development is to say, okay, there's going to be setbacks, but you have to be willing to fail forward. You have to be willing to take some risk, but you also have to be able to say, okay, this is not working, and cut it off and be willing to move on, because that's also the hard part. Is like, oh, we've committed X number of millions of dollars, and it turns out that this is a dead end. With AI, we're seeing that it's like, okay, there's dueling approaches. So nobody 4 years ago would have necessarily, other than some theoreticians, wouldn't be able to say, oh, this is how AI is going to advance, right? The LLMs and all that. They didn't necessarily know that the transformer model was the route to the next level of AI success. And so there are going to be that's just evolution. You have to be willing to tolerate that. But the flip side of that is I always want to make sure that we have mechanisms in place that we are conscious of the fact that when a company fails or when a technology project doesn't succeed, we're not just there to gloat. We're there to learn from it, and we're there to help people pick up and move on to the next thing. Because
couldn't agree more.
A lot of the discussion around robotics and automation is like, oh, look at this company failed. And yeah, they're going to fail. A lot of them, that's just the nature of startups.
They were doing something that's never been done before. Like that, it happens. That's one of the risks.
Right? I mean, you mentioned RE Squared, so I'm going to pick on your neighbors for a moment, but RE Squared is a great company. I knew a lot of people involved, had the
Love those guys.
Visiting them. And then they got bought by Sarcos, which then pivoted away from hardware. But I recently learned that some of the teams that were at RE Squared are still working on the same projects they had started back there, whether it's on manipulation and handling of certain materials, or remotely operated systems. And so it encouraged me to say, oh, they're carrying it forward. Maybe not under the same company banner. And again, things change, but that progress can continue as long as you make sure that the talent is the most precious resource. I mean, everyone's like, oh, it's the IP. Oh, yeah. But it's the people who make that IP that are really the ones you want to hang on to.
Yeah, exactly. Do you want the goose that laid the golden egg, or do you want a little bit of gold?
That as we see consolidation in the market, as we see economic uncertainty and tough times for certain large segments, I mean, we've reported that for the largest industrial automation providers, a lot of their revenues are like down 30% year over year. We have to recover that. It's tough, but we have to understand that and put it into context. And that's really what a lot of my mission is trying to help explain things to people who are already in that industry.
What's going on with the industrial automation providers, just as somebody that's relatively naive to that market?
So one of the things is that there was a lot of expectation that the automotive industry would massively retool, both for reshoring and also for electrification of vehicles. And that's taken longer, and it's not been as straightforward as people first thought, right? The demand for EVs in the US for infrastructure and other reasons was slow. And so the big three automakers put the brakes literally on a lot of their plants that convert large portions of their fleet into electric vehicles. And that's even before the political situations change.
That makes sense. So I get, if I'm following that, it sounds like the robotics companies had spun up a lot of production anticipating a demand, then got short-circuited, and so they overproduced, and that's why this situation ended up where it is.
So we saw that in the mobile robot market with logistics and warehousing after the pandemic, that everyone had either bought robots and they weren't exactly sure how they were going to use, or there was the assumption that the demand for e-commerce would continue growing at the same rate that it had. But in fact, when the pandemic wound down, people went back to brick and mortar stores. And so there was that slump, and a lot of the mobile robot providers then had layoffs. That happens. It's unfortunate, but those are market adjustments. The notion of a new normal turns out to be somewhat false, because there hasn't been a new normal in the last 4 to 5 years. And so we have to now say, okay, how do we apply automation? How do we apply business models to be flexible, to be resilient, to survive in these uncertain times?
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I mean, to some extent, I think it's always been that way. I mean, the best businesses through the centuries have been ones that were, resilient in recessions, able to adapt to just, I mean, think about like the horse and buggy going away in favor of the automobile, or, like automation in factories as opposed to, doing everything by hand, or embracing the assembly line, as opposed to like the craftsman model.
Well, and that goes back to what you were asking me before about the robotics for good in the RBR50, right? As with any technology, robots are a tool, and it's human judgment of how to apply that. Yes, we could make weapons that are fully autonomous, and that's sort of hard to put that genie back in the bottle. But there's so many more applications, many of which we are just beginning to address, of, okay, maybe we don't replace human nurses, but we make their lives a lot easier. So they can focus on the patients.
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe instead of making people push heavy carts for miles and miles, 12 miles a day through a warehouse that's not air conditioned, or that is freezing because it's cold storage, we put in an ASRS and we have people at the perimeter doing the things that people are still building the robots at, right? And there's so many of those types of things that I get excited about, because we only scratch the surface. I do see a day where I'm stuck in an airport at 3 a.m. and instead of having to wander around an empty food court, there's robots able to serve.
Yeah, which is awesome.
Right. And that's not that far away. Or, if there are places that humans should not go in the bottom of the coal mine, at the top of a electrical tower, or a wind tower.
The inside of a generator.
Inside of a generator. Exactly. There's lots of great applications for robots that we're all beginning to address. I want it to get to the point where you go into a machine shop, or you go into a maintenance shop, and the robots are there.
Yeah. So
your ATVs today.
I was in a medium-sized manufacturing facility yesterday where I was watching universal robot arms put in screws and assemble things. And there were a ton of technicians working with these robot arms. Like, it was not an empty facility. There were not, it didn't have the vibe of a place where the management wanted to cut staff. It had the vibe of a place where the management wanted to give people more engaging, higher value jobs and hire the best folks and give the menial screw putting in jobs to robots that are better suited to those jobs.
Right. And that's also one of the things that I think we have a ways to go. If we're really going to do reshore manufacturing in this country,
It's the only way.
And in high productivity, you're going to need robots, right? We're never going to beat China in terms of amount of people. That's not the way.
Or cost of human labor.
Or cost of human labor. So we have to compete smarter. And fortunately, this country has a real history of innovation in that way. And so if we apply robots as force multipliers in every field, healthcare, science, research, we do have to make sure that in the service industries, the people that we displace, we figure out how to retrain them properly, or people in old line manufacturing and other industries that we help them retrain or retool. And that's where ease of use becomes important for the robot developers. It's also where, as a society, we can't just say, industry can't say it's the government's responsibility. Government can't say it's academia's responsibility. Academia can't say it's corporate. Like, we have to share that, right? And there's still too much of that finger pointing. Again, there are some great institutions. I mean, you have the Arm Institute in Pittsburgh. There are some great organizations that are working on solving those problems. I'd like to see that happen on a national or even global scale, where we say, okay, someone who might have been in a service job that was menial, right? Scrubbing floors, flipping burgers, pushing carts around. All those jobs eventually can be automated, or at least assisted by automation. Let's make sure that those people in all those spaces still have meaningful work, because otherwise that resentment or fear of technology is not unfounded, right? That there is a responsibility to make sure that we take care of everyone, because not everyone can be a robotics engineer.
Absolutely.
But there's plenty of room for robotics technicians. There's plenty of room for people who use robots to do their jobs better.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. No, I mean, again, I'm excited to see what what this year brings, what the next year brings after that. I mean, what the next 10 years brings.
I can assure everyone who's listening that you and your jobs and your roles are not obsolete, but you're going to have to change. And that's a challenge that we all face, is that we have to continue evolving. And I'm really excited, both at our events and our ongoing coverage, but also knowing folks like you and companies like SK Robotics that have won the Army R50, that you guys are really innovating and pushing that envelope for all of us.
Well, thanks, Eugene. I appreciate your work as well. I think this is a beautiful note to end on. So as we kind of trickle off the end of the episode, is there anything you want to plug?
Well, so we have upcoming later this year, we have a series of webinars around automated warehouse, which is one of the sites I work on. We also have the RoboBusiness event in Santa Clara in October. I'd love to see you all there. Certainly check out the Robot Report and the Robot Report podcast. Our website and podcast are always covering things year round. So we're also always looking for people to tell us about the things that you're working on. I can only be in so many places at once. I really appreciate the people who reach out to us and say, oh, this article was helpful, or I'd like to learn more about this, or here's something that I'm doing that you may not know about. And I always love learning from our readers.
And I will say that just working with you guys over the years, I mean, everybody I've worked with at WTWH is just super friendly, super intelligent, super easy to work with. Great organization, huge fan.
Thank you for that. We work hard at
things
it.
To say. I mean, your whole acronym is willing to work harder. So,
yes.
Yeah, I love that as well. So, Eugene, thanks for coming on. It's been a pleasure. I'm looking forward to our next interaction.
Excellent. I look forward to it also.
Thanks for joining us today. If you've made it this far, chances are you'll like other episodes too. Collaborative with Spencer Krause can be found on YouTube, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, and Radio Public. Subscribe today to get notified when the latest episodes release and support the channel. Collaborative with Spencer Krause is sponsored by SKA Robotics. If you're in the market for elite field robotics expertise, please consider hiring SKA Robotics. They sponsor this podcast and solve some of the toughest engineering problems in the world. SKA Robotics can be found at skarobotics.com.